Hello and welcome to Maritain Musings. I'm Dr. Matthew Minard, here with the American Maritain Association, and very gladly joined today by our former fearless leader, former president, Dr. James Hanink, who now is a retired and independent scholar. And Dr. Hanink is going to talk to us today about the work by Jacques Maritain, Existence and the Existent. Existence and the Existent. So I would like to just welcome you, James, Dr. Hanink, to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to hopefully follow our script well enough along and go through some questions that are pretty standard for each book to try and just delve into the topic of the book and your relationship to Maritain. So can you just say something to the viewership about your connection to the work of Jacques Maritain?
I guess it began with a recommendation. I was in minor seminary and about to go major, and I asked a faculty member who subsequently went on to become the bishop of Grand Rapids, Michigan, which, by the way, is the Athens of the Midwest. I asked him if there's something he could recommend that I read to get in the right frame of mind. And lo and behold, he gave me Raissa Maritain's Adventures in Grace, and we have been friends together. And I can't imagine that too many places would have had that kind of recommender make that kind of a recommendation. So I think it's providential. Of course, that was written by Raissa. In terms of actually reading Jacques, it was one snippet at a time in The Catholic Worker. And a number of those snippets had to do with the primacy of the spiritual. Now, as it happened, by the time I visited The Catholic Worker and hung out for a while, by the way, we pioneered hanging out. Marty Corbin, who was the editor of the paper, told me he really didn't like Maritain that much. And I've been wondering, and I think it's because he was already, Martin Corbin was already a liberation theology sort of person. And later on, you might have an occasion to speak with Mario Ramos Reyes, and he has a lot to say about the influence of Maritain in Central and South America, waning abruptly with the entrance of liberation theology. Now, one thing led to another, and I failed to clear the hurdles of youth and wound up in graduate school. And lo and behold, the teacher that I most enjoyed was Stephen Toulmin. And probably the younger Thomists of our time aren't that familiar with his name, or perhaps have never heard it, but he was a student in the past of Wittgenstein, turned towards philosophy of science, ultimately wound up at the University of Southern California, but he was there at Michigan State, and one of his courses was 20th century philosophers, and we did 2 papers each, and I did one on, what's his name, Chomsky? No, it's Chomsky. One on Noam Chomsky, and another on Jacques Maritain. And as I recall, the title was, Why Study Maritain? And I thought to myself, well, I've been reading around Maritain and bits of Maritain for a good long time. Why not do a paper on him? So I did. And it was fairly well received. Toulmin was truly a man of literature. I think he probably thought of Maritain more as literature than philosophy. But at any rate, lo and behold, shortly after I did that paper, Tillman, who was a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, had an essay, his essay of the quarter, and he mentioned Jacques Maritain. And I doubt very much if he would have otherwise. Well, then one thing led to still another thing, and I came to Loyola Marymount University, where I held forth for 40 years. And looking back, I more fully than ever appreciate the way of referring to Loyola Marymount, a university built on a bluff. Geographically, that's so. University built on a bluff and maintained on that same premise. There's probably an introduction of an extra term in that line of argument. However, it's as true as it gets. And I came eventually to teach metaphysics, but for a long time it was ethics and social philosophy. And I regularly drew on person and the common good, regularly. And I can remember telling one of my colleagues at that point, Paul Whiteman, who went on to Notre Dame, about the marvels of the person and the common good, and how we had there not just social philosophy, but we also had really in-your-face metaphysics. And that really surprised me, but I always profited from that.
I think that will be a very interesting text when we do one of these talks, actually, because as you know, there's sort of a revival of some of the line of criticism that came from DeConnick and others. Some young people are starting this sort of revisiting of the topic. So I had to do a thesis recently where I reread the book because I wanted to, make sure that I wasn't just a blind Maritain follower. It's a marvelous text, and it's very well argued as well. And then the bit of trivia that I don't know if you know this or not, because it's not something that's usually talked about much. He actually sent that to Garrigou Lagrange to look at, and Garrigou Lagrange was completely fine with it. He made a couple of, I think 4 little remarks, but it was around the same time. That book's from around the same time as Existence and the Existent. And so he's at Rome, and he sends it to him because there's all this stuff brewing in America and in Canada. But it's an excellent text. Teaching Byzantines, though, I don't get to teach it. So it was a thesis at Holy Apostles. But so yeah, anything else then? I think
the Existent is a pretty Byzantine text itself.
Well, yeah, it's Byzantine in the transferred sense. If we're going to keep taking terms and transferring their meaning metaphorically. Although I think, in view of some of our banter before then, our discussion before the podcast and your kind of notes that you put together, I think that you see a certain through line in it, actually. I see a through line in the way you present it, even if you've not thought of that. But we'll come to that in a second. Is there anything you want to say, too, maybe about your time then serving as the valiant leader of the American Maritain Association? Just your last point for our viewers to have some awareness.
It's not location. It's logistics.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership involves emails and more emails and checking in with hotels and seeing if so-and-so can get from some European venue to some place in Pennsylvania.
Right before, and now we've done a number in Philadelphia, but Jim could also be thinking, I think this was right after your tenure, though. We held the conference in Pittsburgh right before COVID. So you can have them come to somewhere in Pennsylvania.
Oh, that was there.
Yeah, just before a pandemic.
Yes.
Well,
so that's what really is the daily work of the position.
Yeah. Yeah, it's our current president is very good with those details. I fear that, every time you choose an academic, will an academic be able to handle these logistics? Well, let's keep moving because I'll want to banter, and then they'll say, I didn't sign up to watch these people come from one coast and the other to talk about these things, but about a book. So,
Just a second.
yeah.
This is the book.
Oh, I'm sorry about this boring version. Hold on, I
Oh,
should.
you've got a boring version, dude.
Oh, hold on. For those
This
of you
is
who are getting us by audio, Jim has up, and I think it's an edition that was published by who was the publisher of that edition, actually?
well, I think it's Paulist.
Yes, it is, which is a little bit surprising. And is that the one that
It's
John
a hecker.
Trapani?
It's a hecker of an edition.
Yeah. Mine is Pantheon, slightly older version I got after leaving the monastery. Uh, yeah, when I was just sort of devouring everything I could read by Maritain. But why don't you give just a high level overview? You can choose your cruising range, altitude, just to give an outline of the book, the contents, what are the topics covered. Someone who's potentially thinking of reading it. It's not a huge book by him, even though it's very dense. It's about 150 pages in my edition, probably comparable in yours.
Well, deep subject there. When you say high level, I think of high altitude. So what I'm thinking of is just very general themes here. And I'm going to shamelessly work from notes. Uh, in metaphysics, in metaphysics, what we have emphasized from the beginning of the text till the end is the act of existing, actus essendi. And that's understood by way of analogy. And that leads us out, it's a sort of an avenue into reality. And that leads us to any number of reflections on the primacy of the human person in this whole incredible, vast universe of ours. So there's that. And then in theory of knowledge, we have what he refers to in Untrammeled Approaches, his last substantive philosophical work, as intuitivity. Intuitivity. So we have the intuitiveness of the senses, and we have the intuition that's involved in the intellect. And because really of that intuitivity, we have what he sometimes refers to as the nuptial relationship between person and reality. And I guess you could trace that back to Aristotle in Latin. He would have learned it had things worked out for him. Anima quodammodo omnia, the soul in some sense is everything, not everything at one time, but has the capacity to grasp the intelligibility of any one thing. Now, in ethics, what we have is, in a distinct sense, an existential account of the character of conscience. Conscience is by no means a blueprint applied to the craziness of life. But what we have in conscience is the act of existence reaching out in a singular way to every particular event which the subject confronts. Maritain says, strictly speaking, no act is ever repeated. The circumstances of an action are always in some way different. And of course, the agent is always different. And the agent differs from one time to the next time. And so there's something new produced in every human action. And that has to be understood, of course. And how could we understand it otherwise? in terms of the whole human moral enterprise. What are we all about? What is our doing directed towards? And it's not as if we have these unique acts separated from the rest of reality. They're part and parcel of reality, and they're ordered to the final end of reality, which, of course, and Maritain never tires of telling us this, is a sharing in God's own existence. So we have, at the highest level, an account of what metaphysics is, what it's all about distinctively for the Thomist, and the very same thing with a theory of knowledge, and the very same thing again with ethics. And along the way, you've spoken of the denseness of the book. Along the way, we have a rapid fire laying out of all the principal metaphysical questions that you'd find in the much, much, much longer degrees of knowledge, which again is an intertwining of theory of knowledge with metaphysics. John Trapani, who wrote the introduction to my version of, my edition of Existence and the Existent, says at one point, now the footnotes in this text are extremely technical. Now, readers of Maritain know that at least 50% of the action is going on in the footnotes. And since 50% of the action is going on in the footnotes, to say that they're extremely technical is to note their denseness. And Ralph McInerney, another quondam, not quodamodo, but quondam president of our association, said in his discussion in the very rich hours of Jacques Maritain, McInerney says that it's a whirlwind exposition, and it would bewilder most readers. And I would say that unless you've mucked about a good deal in Thomistic metaphysics, you're going to be in the undertow.
I think that's correct. One thing that surprised me, I know that it's in some of your comments later below, that you don't structurally then include as a main topic the predestination stuff. So was there a reason for that choice?
That's because I don't go deep into the grass.
Uh-huh.
But the predestination business is covered really in Maritain's saying explicitly, although not quite in this language, there's not one shred of existence that God doesn't put into place. And it's not the case that he does this seriatim, but it's all at once that God puts into place every shred of existence. And of course, we know that St. Paul uses the term predestination. And it all connects with his treatment. And you've mentioned that you want to give this much more of a discussion in a different podcast. It all connects with his discussion of unde malum, whence cometh evil, and it comes not from God's doing, it comes from man's doing, and it comes in man's ignoring what we could call a shatterable inclination that God gives us. We are always inclined towards the good, but we ignore the measure that we must take in seeking the good. But God knows all of that, and so there is a sense in which predestination, in a chilling Calvinist way, has to be addressed. But I think Maritain does succeed in addressing it. And maybe we could come back to this when we talk
Sure.
directly about the problem of evil.
No, that's fine. Yeah, and I did, out of fairness to Dr. Hanink, I said we're going to do a later podcast on just the theme because there are some developments in Maritain's thought on the problem of evil and the problem of predestination. But some people who've encountered this book see that as one of the main divisions. I feel a little bit like you, and maybe this is me being a Byzantine soul. I'm not haunted like an Augustinian by these problems. Augustine's very haunted by this. It doesn't keep me up at night the same way, and so I feel comfortable almost sometimes setting it aside. Whereas I think there are some people who would say that I should be anathematized for not caring. But we have to keep moving, or we'll barely make it through your outline here of things. So I'm going to move us to the next question. So we've already hinted at this fact. It's a short work. It's even in the French, Court traité de l'existence et l'existant. It's a short treatise on existence and the existent, but it's a dense work. So I encountered the work just randomly, probably just as you were saying at the wrong time, right? That it's not the sort of thing you should jump feet first into if the water's not deep enough yet in your engagement with Maritain. Definitely don't dive head first in.
And you have to have a high tolerance for metaphor because there's at least a metaphor in every other sentence that Maritain uses.
And there are things in this book. That's a good point because there are things in this book that have turned people off to Maritain that I've known because they don't like just the example you use, shatterable, as something applied to kind of a philosophical or metaphysical analysis of sufficient grace. So how did you first encounter it? A, how did you first encounter it? And then B, what was the subject that most drew you in? Um,
Right. I think this particular text I first encountered when I was teaching John Crosby's The Selfhood of the Human Person. And that text presents phenomenological realism in dialogue with the tradition, as we Thomists often say. And there are many points at which Crosby agrees with Maritain, but some points at which he explicitly disagrees. And one point caught my attention in particular. It was our knowledge of subjectivity. And as a phenomenological realist, Crosby wants to say, we have that. Now, instead of speaking of subjectivity directly, he speaks of self-presence. And he says we do have a knowledge of self-presence. And then he says, on this point, I take issue with Maritain. So is he right? Well, to take issue with him, Maritain says in our text, Existence and the Existent, and this is a direct quote, subjectivity as subjectivity is inconceptualizable. Inconceptualizable. And we have, for the most part, knowledge by way of concepts, so we really can't have any concept of our own subjectivity. That's what he's saying. And I think when I came to push and poke at both Maritain and Crosby, I think it's a case of dramatic presentation versus dramatic presentation and a little analytic, and that's my background, picking and poking, can pick through the dramatic dimension and come to a sphere of compatibility. I think, for example, Crosby says that we do this better, this confrontation with self-presence, when we think back. But when we think back, we're already out of the immediate. And Maritain, for his part, talks about how in many places, including Existence and the Existent, how we come to know ourselves in love. We come to know ourselves in love. We certainly don't know ourselves as an object in love. In love, we share in the kind of generosity that characterizes God's love for us. And in love, I think we do have an awareness of subjectivity. So I think it turns out to be a compatibilism, but both sides stress one aspect of it or the other aspect of it.
I almost want us to, end on. There's a quote at the end of that third chapter where he talks about basically he's applying this love. He talks about love plays the role of mediating the knowledge that we have of other subjects, and I think it would apply to ourselves as well. There's a certain self manifestation of ourselves in the elan of love itself, that it does something like what the gifts of the Holy Spirit do in the order of the speculative or the mystical gifts for the contemplative gifts of the Holy Spirit. I mean, that's clearly what he's building on. There's a big apparatus, as you know, underneath the hood too. There's all this stuff about mystical experience in the natural order, right? So there's a whole set of apparatus pieces that you have to sort of dig into then to see that this is not just lyricizing as it might come across.
Yes,
Uh,
it's noteworthy that Maritain had a real interest in the natural mysticism of various Indian schools of thought.
mhm.
I think that's very noteworthy. And Matthew Pugh, one of our former colleagues, really developed this.
Mm. Okay. But just that I don't remember. You'd think I would pay attention when I'm putting the books up online, uh, on the website. Okay, so let's drill down then into some specific topics. So first, can you discuss some of the metaphysical themes which have already been in the background? So in a certain sense, you're going to now be taking your threads and tying them into a nice bow for our listeners, concerning being, existence, our cognition of being, and so forth, that he has in the first chapter of the book. And then in particular, as much as can be done in brief form, can you explain to a listener who's just walked in what is meant whenever Maritain speaks of the intuition of being, something, an expression that sometimes gets people rather bothered?
Yes.
So,
Uh, First of all, don't think of intuition as I have this hunch. This is intuition in the sense of eidetic visualization.
Mhm.
It's an intellectual grasp. It's not some sort of emotional hunch. And one has this intellectual intuition in the act of judgment. And there is no act of judgment unless there's, first of all, an abstractive apprehension. And there is no abstractive apprehension unless there is sense impression. So it's not as if somehow we're catapulted into outer space and we have a hunch. Nothing like that whatsoever. Now, where might one experience uh, intuition of this sort? Well, there's a generic term. There are certain irreducible singularities. Stuff happens that's unique, and we happen upon, in our own unique way, unique stuff. So, and here he does borrow from Bergson. Sometimes we just have this sense of time passing, and it's arresting. It's arresting. And we might at that point come to have an intuition of being. And oftentimes, when things get difficult, we have a sense of the implacability of of things. Uh, Geez, no matter what I do, I can't wish the world away. It's here to stay. It is. It is. So there's an implacability. And then, of course, there are moral realities that are singular. We've already touched on this. Uh, Here I am. Do I or do I not? And that can open us up to the isness, the ongoing isness, everything that is. At the same time, while there are these singularities, Maritain notes that as philosophers, we might come to have an intuition of being simply in reflecting on the structure of cognition. How does all of this work? We go from sense to abstraction from sense to judgment that these things are, they really are. And isn't it extraordinary that we have this cognitive apparatus? Isn't it extraordinary that we, as he says poetically, are in a nuptial relationship with being? And that might lead to it. Now, there are all sorts of implications of this eidetic visualization, this intellectual intuition. And one of them, I think, is that we recognize the analogous character of being. Everything is what it is and not another thing, and everything is what it is in its own way. And sometimes we're aware of this, but lots of times we're aware of, I am the center of the world, but it's been that way for so long that I've gotten quite used to it. Thank you. Thank you very much. But that viewpoint, even though it comes upon us quite, or frailty of human nature, quite often and persistently, that's not how things are at all. An intuition of being can help us to see that.
I think I was surprised here just looking. There's not a to the viewership. We've not like pre-gamed this whole thing, but if a one of our interviewees has notes, very often, it's helpful to have those notes. So you didn't mention among your list the experience of one's own being. I think it was sort of present when you talked about. I think that's
And
very important because I myself, I can, from my own experience, think about those moments where you're aware of the fact you don't not exist. You actually exist. And you're aware of the fact you're aware of that. So this is not something that's just like you said, a kind of intuition in the sense of a hunch, right? You know what I mean? I got a feeling that I exist. No, it is a
yeah,
face. You are faced with your existence, right? It is
oh,
not.
that feeling, Matthew, go with it. Go
Yeah.
with it.
So, because I think this is important because people they
Yeah,
hear this, and I'm sure you've run into this over the years. This um the sort of assertion that this is just a leftover remnant of Henri Bergson in him, that
mhm.
he's just basically tried to like find enough cracks within the Thomistic framework of metaphysics to shove some of this in, and it's not that. And I think it's so important to see it, um, like, as part of this human experience of not just the facticity of things, but the being of things speaking to our mind, which is made for being, but for existence then too, to be able to affirm that things exist and they exist according to all their various modalities as well. So
Yes,
that's yeah.
and he cites on that very point most often a passage from Raisa. And Raisa, as I mentioned at the outset, was the first Maritain that I read. She says so often it's come upon her, not just occasionally, but often it's come upon her that she is, that, that she's been snatched from the abyss in order to be uh, powerful.
Yeah, and it's to put it's I am. So when you say it's not objectivizable, like as he does in this text, he's making the point that whatever is cognitively going on for that apprehension or for that judgment, really, right? For that judgment, it's touching down on something that can't be lifted up into that same genericity that you have by way of the first operation of the intellect, by defining, by speaking in terms of only essences. Right. And this is something you have to find a way. You don't take that experience and then try and find a way to shove it into another epistemology. You have to look at your epistemology and then say, what do I have to build out to account for that clear datum of the phenomenon of the experience that you have of the world, of this, of yourself, of realities. Yeah.
Primitive.
A primitive, exactly. This date, like respect the datum and let the datum then speak to
Mhm.
what your
Mhm.
your explanatory schema is for
At the
that.
same time, none of that is a kind of a phenomenological thing.
Correct.
There might be a quasi-phenomenological setting, but what you want to do is to grasp the ontological foundation of it.
Yeah, and I think your switch from I said phenomenon, but datum is better. The
Yeah,
given. This is the given that you now are then giving an ontological analysis of. I mean, that's the Thomist
yeah.
mode of, yeah.
And contrary to the analytic uh, struggles in which I was educated, the given is not a myth,
Hmm.
and the given is certainly not a sense datum.
Yes. Well, that's the other problem. I say datum, and that's exactly what I thought. I was like, you could go the other side and say, be careful with the word datum. Little
Yes,
bland packets of sense datum are
yes,
floating in the background. The
right,
datum, the given, is much more much richer than that. I'm
yes.
thinking of because like le donné révélé, like one speaks of the revealed datum. Um, right? That's far more than just a sense datum. Okay. Well, for the next like little subsection in the write up I gave to organize our time together, we come now to my favorite part of the book, which is the action part, which I
An
think you know.
activist
Yeah,
philosopher.
I know. Who would have thought? Who would have thought an ex-monk being an activist? You've already very well. I mean, you very well have spoken to it where you talked about conscience actually, and it's very refreshing to have someone talk about this book with that kind of appreciation. I really do mean that, Jim, because I think this is such an important aspect of what Thomism has to offer regarding moral, lack of better terms, moral psychology, a deeper appreciation of prudence than I think. I mean, it's built on Aristotle, but I think it goes really deep, quite deep, into the implications for what moral reasoning is, what discernment of conscience is for human agents. So, can you just maybe again kind of wrap the bow up based on what you said earlier and just give a sort of summary of what Maritain has to say? And you can aver back a little bit to what you said
Mm.
about action and then the importance of this for moral philosophy. And if you so desire, moral theology. I tend to think in both categories because of my day job, so to speak, since I do both. But
Don't give up your day, Jeff.
no, it structures life. It structures life. It keeps me from being too crazy.
By the way, I never retired. I just redirected. Now,
Yes.
let me borrow from another Maritain Association president, John Trapani. I've mentioned him once. Let me mention him again. He refers to this section as giving us a metaphysics of the practical intellect. Metaphysics of the practical intellect. So, if we're talking about action, we're going to be talking about right reason and action. And when we talk about right reason and action, we have to talk about the reasoner who's doing the right reason. And Maritain wants to say that what we're looking for is the completion of human life. And this is something that we do along a dynamic path in exercising charity. In our acts of love, we grow in love, and our love is of, first and foremost, existence. Ourselves as an existent, our fellow existence, and of course, God as esse ipsum And so we could think of the moral life as an adventure in more than one place and in more than one context. Maritain speaks about life as an adventure. So we are in an adventure of dialogue with the ultimate act of love. Uh, and in doing so, we exercise moral judgments. And we exercise moral judgment through acts of conscience, and we've spoken about that. And we could say that conscience is a singular grasping of the moral law in the presence of God. And in a way that I think is not a maintaining of tensions, but a proper integration of two poles, as it were. Maritain says this integration in this grasping of the singular in the presence of God is rooted in reason. It's rooted in reason. And he does say explicitly, liberty is rooted in reason. And you think perhaps, we could think perhaps of what's necessary for free choice. We don't think that non-human animals, I certainly don't think that non-human animals have liberty. And why is it that they couldn't have liberty? Because they don't have the kind of reason that enables them to consider alternatives, to review the past and the present, to draw universals out of particulars and to act on that basis. Because of that, they could be unfettered. But it's one thing to be, unfettered, and another thing to have liberty.
That's a great summary. Great summary. The root and the roots of it all go down really deep. It's solid Thomistic basis, but I think it is just an excellent. I like that expression, metaphysics of the practical intellect. I think that's a very good line from John. I'm going to keep plowing us along now because I know that banter will push me aside at every corner that I go by. So, what does Maritain have to say about the existent, which you already, rhetorically were starting to emphasize, even with regard to the action chapter, showing some of the thematic through line of the text. So can you discuss some of the implications of what he says in relation to, and you can choose here, whichever theme or themes you want to land down on, the uniqueness of the human person, our knowledge of other persons, if you so desire, also to the, some of the metaphysical analysis of subjectivity as such, broadly applied to all supposita, to all existence. But I'll leave you have the floor for the breadth and the topics that you want to discuss in that regard.
Well, we certainly want to talk about the subject, and to speak of the subject is to speak of suppositum, and the subject is affirmed in judgment. Who is it that's judging? And just as act depends on substance, substance depends on act. There's this interweaving. Now, I find very intriguing and very difficult his discussion of subsistence. And he presents subsistence as a substantial mode. So we have the subject, and the subject is a suppositum, and the suppositum subject is a substance. Now, subsistence is a substantial mode, and he speaks of it as that which makes a subject to be a subject, that which, he says, constitutes an essence as an in itself, And I don't think he uses hyphens very often, but subsistence constitutes an essence as an in itself, and this is something I think is very important, incommunicable. And it's in the human being that we as substances really come to have our persona, our persona. So there's so much to be said, I think, that's intriguing about this subsistence. Uh, it, it involves the soul's generation, as it were, of a disposition to constitute a person, a disposition to constitute a person. Uh, in one way of thinking, we could say that personality, and that's a term he uses well in The Person and the Common Good. And I was surprised the first time I saw personality rather than person. Personality is the subsistence of the soul communicated to a human composite. And this is very intriguing, but it is a sidebar, and I won't push it at all unless you pull or push. The Dominican, James Rooney, has suggested that just as we have the soul in this life, and the very same soul in the life to come, absent the body in the life to come until the resurrection, we nonetheless have an identity. And what is this identity based on? It's based on the soul. It's based on the soul's disposition to constitute a person. And what is this? Well, this is the personality that the soul produces. That is the incommunicability that the soul produces. Now, that said, and stop me if I go off the deep end, I think Rooney's overly ambitious. I think there is no continuity of the person without a material continuity. And when anybody tells me about atomic bombs and cannibals, that sort of thing, destroying any hope of material continuity, I say, Geach wasn't put off by that. He said, how are we to know? But in fact, and this is, I think, an almost always overlooked text in Aquinas. Aquinas says in his discussion of the resurrection that the angels will go forth to gather the bits and pieces, to sustain our material identity. And I don't think he said that out of some sort of pious twitch. I think the angels are oftentimes overlooked in ordinary life, and I think the role is overlooked in the interim period. However, all this comes to us by way of subsistence, which is a mode of substantiality. Which mode of substantiality makes us in our self of selves to be incommunicable?
Yeah, and I think, just to pull slightly, that Rooney is addressing that. It's that same issue that's sort of it's the hot thing, or at least it was maybe a few years ago in certain philosophical debates about the personhood of the separated substance, the separated soul.
Mm-hmm.
Because even textually, Thomas has texts where he makes the point that person denotes a whole, and so the soul, insofar as it's a part of the complete composite, is lacking something in the perfection of personhood. Um, I don't want to, somewhat like the problem of evil sorts of debates. I don't like weighing in there because people get very hot and bothered. I share your reservation that you need to make sure that you build in enough room into your theory concerning the personhood of the separated soul that you recognize the fact that the material continuity has a profound implication for the continued, not only the continued uniqueness of the human person, but even the personhood. Um, but that being said, you do have to say something that the subsistence in this very specific metaphysical sense, this constitutive principle of substance rendering it incommunicable, keeps the soul incommunicable during the period after death before the resurrection.
Yes,
So it's
yes,
tough. There's both of those elements are needed. It's just that if you lean too much in the one direction, you lose the importance of the soul's orientation to its body And I think that that's
Yes,
what's motivating your point is to,
yes.
yeah.
And if we don't have the incommunicability of the soul in this interim period, we have the temptation, an occasion of metaphysical sin, to slide into Buddhism.
Hmm.
We kind
Yeah.
of slide into the absolute, the one. And, and I was just saddened to see that towards the very end of her life, Simone Weil came more and more to express herself in terms that really have a Buddhist ring to them.
Hmm. And I
And
think
I
you're right. You
also,
can. Mhm.
I think in popular spirituality, this is fairly often the case. I'm going to lapse into the one. I will become one with God. Well, no, you won't.
Yeah.
Share in God's life, but you won't become one with God.
Hmm. Even the term incommunicability, because this is all coming from, right, the Christology. The Thomists developed the notion of subsistence very much because of Christology. You see
Yeah.
this in Degrees of Knowledge, where Maritain, even over the course of his career, he sort of fusses a bit with his own position. There's an essay on subsistence that is included in there. Um, but that term incommunicable kind of actually just clicked something in my head. The one unique thing about the kind of subsistence that the human soul has makes us different than angels is that existence, that the existence that is communicated, so not the subsistence, but the existence which is communicated by the suppositum is communicated by the soul to the body. There is this communication to the body of the existence that the soul is rendered apt to have by subsistence, that is of the very nature of that subsistence. That subsistence takes, so to speak, I'm going to speak in condemnable kind of language here to try and make
Oh,
it well, not condemnable to the Inquisition, but maybe to fellow Thomists. But I'm trying to simplify this to someone who's survived our conversation this far. That if subsistence renders the essence, the soul, to be capable of existence, it renders it capable of a kind of existence that is meant to be communicated, however, to the body, and that there's something missing from the whole purpose of personality in our case, making us different from angelic persons. There's something really missing to our personality if that communication does not take place, either by our current wayfaring embodiment or our glorious, hopefully, glorious embodiment, not damned embodiment in the hereafter. So that's more of just a way to kind of wrap back around and say, I think there's something interesting in what Rooney is saying there, but I think that you're, that caveat you make is actually quite correct. So I'll leave you. That's your bit. I'll let you respond to that, and then we'll keep moving on, or we can just keep moving on.
let's move on.
Okay. So
Out with this one admission. I think the majority of contemporary Thomists uh, don't share your concern. I think the majority in the debate you've mentioned uh, don't think that material continuity is necessary uh, at all. And I think the majority is mistaken in that regard.
okay, yeah, that's fine. I'll be honest. It's somewhat of a debate that I don't wade into in great detail, just because I want to affirm maybe something that would at least recognize. I affirm a pretty standard position that you can find in somewhat Maritain and Jean Hervé Nicolas, and I'm just happy with that. I guess that's the short story.
Yeah.
Um, just
Well,
we have our best.
bodies aren't there in a warehouse like robots to be ensouled. Each body is uniquely fitted to each soul.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have this view that, well, at the end, God will churn up some fresh prime matter for us. But there's
Yeah.
no prime matter to be churned up.
Yeah. Well, this is you are correct. I mean, I actually do very strongly agree actually with the way you just put it, because that's at the heart too of what Maritain says about actually the male and female aspects of the
Yes, yes,
deeply. That's actually the deep metaphysical kind of
yes,
implication of that. I'm going to kind of fuss with that topic a bit for the
yes. An affinity with Edith Stein there.
yeah. All right. So we mentioned the problem of evil. Luckily, some of that we're going to put off to hopefully. I think it's going to be our expert in such matters, Michael Torre, who has written on this with regard to Francisco Maransola. But we would be a little bit remiss if we didn't mention that there is an earlier exposition of Maritain's position on causality. It's the metaphysics of the problem of evil, primarily viewed, although with a theological lexicon in the background, viewed metaphysically. So can you just briefly say something about the treatment of the problem of evil here in Existence and the Existent?
I think that even though Thomas is oftentimes referred to as braviloquens, and thereby incites people to be not so braviloquens at all. I think there's nothing clearer about the whole discussion than what we find in his carpenter analogy. And I'd like to read shamelessly just a couple of short paragraphs from Thomas. He says, "For in all things of which one ought to be the rule and measure of another, good results in what is regulated and measured, from the fact that it is regulated and conformed to the rule and measure, while evil results from the fact that it is not being ruled or measured. Therefore," and here comes the carpenter, "therefore, suppose there is a carpenter who ought to cut a piece of wood straight by using a ruler. If he does not cut straight, the bad cutting will be due to his failure to use the ruler or measuring bar." And then he continues, "There is no need to seek a cause of this non-use of the aforementioned rule, since the very freedom of the will by which it can act or not act is enough to explain the non-use. And absolutely considered, not actually attending to such a rule is itself not evil, neither moral wrong nor punishment, since the soul is not held, nor is it liable always actually to attend to such a rule." Now, whenever I consider this line, I think, number one, it's correct, and then I think, number two, there is, however, such a thing as negligence. There is such a thing as negligence. If the carpenter is screwed up repeatedly, and he still is doing this, we want to say we have negligence. And I think to come, as Maritain often came, to the immediacy of everyday life. We live in a culture of death, and if people just don't attend to the dignity and the value of human life, and they habitually don't attend to the value and dignity of human life, they cannot be held excused.
I agree.
And we often are such people in certain areas of our lives. I would love it were Maritain here to talk about our blithe possession and further development of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and not taking heed of it, not even thinking about it politically, to be honest, right? It's something that's talk about not culpable non-consideration.
Yeah.
Does it measure the choices that I should be making? That's the way that one should think of it.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that, yeah. So do you want to go into any of the rest of what you've gathered here for this, or would you like us to move along?
Let's move along.
Okay. Um, so I find that I sometimes have something of a strange position, and this will be our last question before we kind of just do our closing out exercises. I refuse to call Maritain an existential Thomist, at least per se. At least per se. But the whole book, nonetheless, witnesses, especially in the final section, and also in that section on action. It's very clear in that chapter on action as well, that he's deeply involved in this book with questions, with positions related to the human person that were raised by mid-century existentialism. And even though, Sartre may not be the current coin of the realm nowadays, these are all still very important philosophical things that are in the air of our culture today. So in light of Existence and the Existent, how do you understand the claim that Maritain embraces a form of existential Thomism or even Thomistic personalism? Those are the two that I sort of, I want to have qualifiers for, but what would you say to the degree that one can call him an existential Thomist? What does that mean in view of this book?
Well, of course, you're right. He does speak of Sartre, and he does say there's a real difference between Sartre's existentialism and Kierkegaard's existentialism, and Sartre seeks to actually essentialize and philosophize about something that is intrinsically religious and individual in nature. I think the existentialist chord that's most significant here for Maritain really is, once again, the primacy of existence, and in God we see the generosity of being, the profound generosity of being. And insofar as we are persons, our personhood is a sharing in the very reality of God, and we ought to exercise our lives by way of a generosity of being, a pouring out of whatever we can pour out, and a receptivity of what we need. And we both need and have God's mercy. And this is really the conclusion of Maritain's text. All of this is ultimately in order to seek the wisdom that is the eternal wisdom.
This is good. I mean, I won't even put snow on that bell. I'll just let it ring. So then, what is the enduring significance, would you say, of existence in the existent? Someone who comes in and says, okay, there's AMA guys talked about a 70-year-old book, 75-year-old book, almost 80-year-old book. Why should someone pick it up and read the new nice edition that you have?
Imagine someone slogging through graduate school. Imagine somebody who's slogged through a graduate school and is now trying to find, yes, employment in philosophy. I say, if you come to terms with this book, you will experience what it is to have amour fou for philosophy, a mad love for philosophy. Because Maritain certainly had a mad love for philosophy, and that gave rise to a passionate poetry that it sometimes perplexes, but has a huge promise for all of us. But you have to wrestle with the text and go back to the text and treat it as a living document.
So, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I could give them the backstory on Confucius.
It's your, in a sense, it's not my platform. I'm just the interviewer. So,
Well, when people talk about philosophers who endure, lots of times people will quote Confucius, but I want to tell our listeners that that's not the way it always was with Confucius. For years, Confucius would say things and people would just kind of shrug it off, look the other direction. And then one day he said, this was his breakout moment, he said, if it's not one damn thing, it's another. Head swiveled. And from that time on, people have paid attention to Confucius. Now, Maritain is like Confucius in this respect. He waded into life, and he recognized that if it wasn't one tragedy, it was another tragedy. And here in this life of ours, there are tears. But he faced up to it and moved ahead.
well, thank you, Jim, very much, Dr. James Hanink, for coming here and giving us such an excellent discussion of the text. This was really enjoyable for me. I'm sure others who are tuning in asynchronously will enjoy this as well. So this has been Dr. James Hanink and Matthew Minard to discuss the book by Jacques Maritain, Existence in the Existent, as part of Maritain Musings, which is an activity or a work of the American Maritain Association. And the pre-production and post-production for the podcast is done by Mr. Michael Hall, whose services we also appreciate. And so we hope that you give us some good ratings to help push us up a little bit in the listings for people to run into this podcast and to benefit from the wisdom of people like Dr. Hanink who have joined us. So thank you very much for your time. God bless.